There is a particular cruelty in the way history treats certain heroes, not by forgetting them, but by remembering only half of what happened to them. The first half is the story of what they did. The second half is the story of what was done to them. And sometimes the second half is so dark, so unresolved, so resistant to the clean endings that human beings need from their stories, that it threatens to swallow the first half entirely. Raoul Wallenberg saved 100,000 lives. Then he vanished into the Soviet system and was never seen again. Both of these things are true. Both of them matter. And the fact that the second one has no ending, no body, no confirmed date of death, no moment of closure, is itself a kind of statement about the world he lived in and the forces that destroyed him. He was 31 years old when he arrived in Budapest in July of 1944, and he was not, by any obvious measure, a man built for what he was about to do. He was a Swedish businessman, the scion of one of Sweden's most prominent banking families, a man who had studied architecture in America and spent his early career in trade and commerce. He had never done anything like this before. He had no training in diplomacy or espionage or the management of large-scale humanitarian operations. He had a briefcase, a diplomatic appointment from the Swedish government, and a clarity of purpose that would turn out to be worth more than any of those things. The situation in Hungary in the summer of 1944 was one of the urgent emergencies of the entire war. Germany had occupied Hungary in March of that year, and Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the final solutions logistics, had arrived almost immediately to begin the deportation of Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz. By the time Wallenberg landed in Budapest, approximately 400,000 Hungarian Jews had already been sent to the death camps in a matter of weeks. The speed and efficiency of the operation was staggering. The Jews of Budapest, approximately 200,000 people, were next. Wallenberg had been sent by the Swedish government at the request of the American War Refugee Board, a newly created organization whose mission was to rescue Jews from Nazi-occupied Europe. He was given a diplomatic passport, a generous budget, and remarkable latitude to do whatever he thought would work. What he thought would work was audacity. He began issuing what he called Schutzpass, protective passports. These were documents printed in blue and yellow, bearing official-looking stamps and seals, which declared the holder to be a Swedish subject awaiting repatriation and therefore under the protection of the Swedish crown. They had no real legal standing under international law. The Nazis were not obligated to recognize them. But Wallenberg understood something about the bureaucratic mind, that a sufficiently official-looking document presented with sufficient confidence could create its own authority. He printed them by the thousands and handed them out as fast as his staff could process the applications. He rented 32 buildings in Budapest and declared them Swedish territory, libraries, offices, annexes of the Swedish legation. He hung Swedish flags from the windows and posted signs in Swedish and German. 15,000 Jews lived in these buildings under Swedish protection. They had no legal right to be there under the rules of war as the Nazis interpreted them. But the buildings were there, the flags were there, and Wallenberg was there, calm, insistent, prepared to argue the point with anyone who challenged him, up and including SS officers. He was not calm by nature. People who knew him described a man under enormous strain, working 20-hour days, sleeping little, eating irregularly, driving himself and his staff to the edge of their endurance because the alternative was people dying. But he had learned or discovered in himself a quality that was essential in the environment he was operating in: the ability to project absolute certainty in situations of complete uncertainty. When he stood in front of a German officer and insisted that the people behind him were Swedish subjects and therefore untouchable, he looked like a man who had never entertained the possibility of failure. It was, in its way, a performance, but it worked. The most extraordinary moment, among many extraordinary moments, came in November of 1944, when Eichmann ordered the forced marches to begin. With the railway deportations disrupted by Allied bombing, the Nazis began marching Budapest Jews on foot towards Austria in winter without food or adequate clothing. People died along the road. Wallenberg drove his car along the column, handing out food and medicine, arguing with guards, pulling people out of the line with Schutzpass documents he pressed into their hands on the spot. At one point, he climbed onto the roof of a train loaded with Jews bound for the death camps and began walking along the roof, handing protective passes down through the ventilation hatches to the people inside, while German soldiers on the platform below fired warning shots to drive him away. He kept passing documents until the guards physically removed him. He then followed the train to the next station and argued with the commandant for the release of everyone holding a Schutzpass. He got most of them off the train. Eichmann, who was not a man given to admiring his enemies, reportedly said of Wallenberg, "I will kill that Jew dog Wallenberg." The threat was never carried out, though not for lack of intent. There was at least one attempt on his life, a truck that appeared to have been deliberately aimed at his car. He survived it and kept working. By January of 1945, the Soviet army was closing in on Budapest. The war for Hungary was almost over. Wallenberg had by this point saved somewhere between 80 and 100,000 lives, a number so large it strains comprehension. He had done it through paperwork and bluff and the sheer force of a personality that refused to accept that the situation was what it was. He had argued, cajoled, bribed, threatened, charmed, and outmaneuvered some of the most dangerous men in Europe. He was 32 years old. On January 17, 1945, he went to meet with Soviet military commanders to discuss the post-war future of the Jews he had protected. He believed the Soviets were liberators. He believed the war's end meant safety. He was wrong on both counts, though the reasons for the second belief were more complicated than simple naivety. He was arrested by Soviet forces. The official reason given, when one was given at all, was vague: suspicion of espionage, or contact with American intelligence, or some other charge that shifted over the years and was never clearly articulated. He was taken to Moscow, to Lubyanka prison, the headquarters of the Soviet secret police, and then, for all practical purposes, he ceased to exist. The Soviet government initially denied knowing anything about him. Then, in 1957, a Soviet deputy foreign minister named Andrei Gromyko produced a document claiming that Wallenberg had died of a heart attack in Lubyanka in July of 1947. No body was produced. No death certificate was shown. The document itself was of uncertain authenticity. Former Soviet prisoners who had been in Lubyanka reported seeing and speaking with Wallenberg after the date of his supposed death. The reports continued for decades.
sightings in various Soviet prisons, accounts from people who had been released and emigrated, fragments of testimony that added up to a picture of a man who was alive somewhere in the Soviet system long after the Soviets claimed he had died. None of it was ever conclusively verified. None of it ever led to Wallenberg. He simply was not there anymore, in any place where anyone could find him. Sweden pressed for answers. His family pressed for answers. Governments around the world pressed for answers. The Soviet Union and later Russia gave responses that were incomplete, contradictory, and never sufficient. A joint Swedish-Russian commission established in the 1990s to investigate his fate concluded that the evidence of his death in 1947 was not reliable, but could not determine what had actually happened. The file remained open. It remains open today. Raoul Wallenberg was granted honorary citizenship by the United States, Canada, Hungary, Australia, and Israel, an honor bestowed on very few people in history. Streets and squares and schools bear his name across the world. The tree planted in his honor at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem, grows in the section reserved for the righteous among the nations, people who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. He saved 100,000 people with a briefcase and an idea and the refusal to accept that the situation was impossible. And then the world that produced Eichmann and Auschwitz produced one more thing: a prison cell and a silence that has never been broken. He was 32 years old when he disappeared. He would be in his hundreds now if he were alive. He is not alive, but the question of exactly when and where and how he stopped being alive is one that the people who know the answer have chosen for 80 years not to share. That silence is its own kind of crime, and Raoul Wallenberg, who spent his life fighting crimes carried out in silence, deserves better than to have his story end inside one.